Hello, I'm Riele, and today I would like to share this watercolor painting process with you while talking some nonsense. The reference was taken by one of my friends and muses at the top of Mount Washington. I love such structures. For me, they symbolize the pinnacle of human achievement, but in order to reach it, you have to cross the enveloping cloud. The rough stone gate in the foreground contrasts with the intricacy of the tower. You might even think that this composition depicts the way from the Stone Age into civilization. Regardless of the meaning I can come up with, this was primarily a practice piece where I was trying to break my mixing habits and familiarize myself with several pigments I don't usually use. So give this video a like and let me walk through my palette. PBR24 is titanium dioxide doped with iron ions, and like any rutile-based pigment, it is opaque and has a rather narrow tonal range. I used it a lot in gouache. I believe the Schminke Horadam gouache line doesn't have a usual yellow ochre and has a PBR24 instead, which is arguably a good thing as it gives a pure, warm yellow color without a greenish cast. Then I'm using a PR122 magenta, which is a great light-fast quinacridone pigment with a wide tonal range, and it makes a great CMYK primary. Having said that, I always lean toward cool reds rather than magenta for the sole red in my palette, so it was a nice break of habit for me. Then I used two blues PB72. It is a variant of cobalt aluminum oxide with some zinc oxide thrown in the mix. It makes a bit lighter but a very intense primary blue color. As most cobalt-based pigments, it granulates quite a bit. One of the reasons for PR122 and PB72 combo was that my magenta spilled over onto this cobalt blue and I wanted to clean my palette by using this accidental mix. By the way, Michael Harding watercolors such as this magenta have honey in them, so they never really settle and solidify, so they are a bad choice for a travel palette. The second blue here is a relatively rare pigment PB71 or zirconium cerulean blue. It has a slightly greener shade and a lighter tone than conventional cobalt-based PB36 and PB35. While the color is maybe not as pure and chromatic as the usual cerulean, it is an interesting pigment with excellent properties and it granulates aggressively. Finally, there are two returning guests in my landscapes, PBR25 benzimidazolone brown, a rich, warm, transparent and highly light-fast organic brown pigment, I can praise it forever, and PB60 Indian Throne blue, a dark valued, somewhat dull organic blue that mixes great blacks. I am working wet on rough paper. These two factors both promote granulation and color separation. You may want to avoid strong granulation in the sky as it might make the color look flat and more material than actual solid objects in the picture. However, granulation can be great for creating texture in the clouds, and here it might even create a sandstorm-like appearance. I add some cerulean blue around the sun to depict the diffraction of light passing through the clouds, called diffraction corona. It is tricky to see around the sun with an unaided eye, but you can see a similar effect more clearly around the moon on a cloudy night. The light that passes through the clouds hits the water droplets and splits into different colors depending on the angle, creating a rainbow-colored halo. While the paper remains very wet, I work on the skies and the largest shapes, and as the paper dries, I transition to smaller and smaller shapes. Timing is key. I want the intricate lines of the tower to bleed and blend, but still remain readable. To this end, I work in two stages. When the paper is still quite wet but not glossy, I paint the first round of lines. Then, when the paper is only wet inside and just cool to touch, I further accentuate the nodes. The graphite sketch showing through is also helping the tower not to melt into nothingness. This approach to painting the tower is an artistic convention. If you look at the reference picture or observe real structures under such weather conditions, you will realize that they almost don't bleed into their surroundings. They lose contrast, but the actual outline remains pretty sharp if your vision is good enough. Such bleeding in watercolor is a convention that creates a certain impression, but poorly reflects the actual appearance. Just like a drawing of a smiley face doesn't actually resemble any actual smiling human, it is an easily readable symbol within our culture at this point. It is worth being aware when you resort to such conventions instead of faithfully reproducing reality. If you use artistic conventions thoughtlessly, especially a certain set of them that is currently in vogue, it might make your artwork appear shallow or at least dated. Here I should recommend the books Color and Light and Imaginative Realism by James Gurney. He discusses this topic in bits throughout both books in passing. By the way, he has an amazing YouTube channel that doesn't need any advertising on my part. Sometimes, however, depicting the icon of something instead of its real appearance can create a hyper-real, larger-than-life look and help define your artistic style. As a non-artistic but purely symbolic example, let's look at this horse burial found in Novy Ilyinovsky II in Kazakhstan. If we ignore what this find implies for the history of horse domestication but just look at this flying gallop pose, we realize that no real living horse actually runs like that, and yet the meaning of this pose is instantly readable almost 4,000 years later. These horses reflect a swift gallop better than gallop itself would. Finding such hyperstimuli in your art may be very powerful, especially when they're fresh and new. Otherwise, you end up with flying horses of the 19th century. Back then, horse racing was a popular sport, and of course, artists were commissioned to depict the races and often ended up with a rocking horse pose with the legs stretched out. This was not due to lack of effort or study. The human eye simply cannot process the speed at which the horse's legs move and gallop. Photography required long exposure times and could not help. Or could it? You have probably seen the horse in motion animation, and once I read the story of its creation, I just had to tell it, because I found its various pieces surprisingly relevant. Leland Stanford, a railroad executive, a politician, and the founder of Stanford University, also was into breeding and training horses. He had a huge horse farm in Palo Alto that later became the university site, and was interested in breeding fastest possible trotters and thus in learning more about their gait. One question at the time was whether horses were completely airborne at any point of their gallop. He hired Edward Muybridge, a famous landscape photographer, to solve this question. Muybridge was an interesting character in his own right. If your question is why his name is spelled like that, he was born Edward James Muggeridge and archaized the spelling of his first name and changed his last name several times throughout his life, while others continued misspelling it up to his gravestone and beyond. He was born in England in 1830. At age 20, he crossed the ocean and worked as a bookseller, first in New York City, then in San Francisco. At age 30, he got into a bad stagecoach accident and sustained head injuries that might have affected his personality, or he at least used it as his defense in court years later. Then he temporarily returned to England and took up photography, tried to get involved in several businesses in Europe that went down because of the Panic of 1866, and came back to San Francisco, this time as a photographer. He photographed mostly landscapes and got several government commissions, including photographing the newly acquired Alaska or the Modoc campaign. In 1872, Muybridge began to photograph Stanford's horses and initially deemed it a hopeless task. At the time, exposure times had to be seconds, both due to the sensitivity of the photographic emulsions and due to shutter speeds. In 1873, Muybridge managed to shoot a very blurry picture of the racehorse Occident running. No copies of this shot survive, so we can't see it. But it was enough to convince Stanford to continue, and he involved several engineers and technicians from the Central Pacific Railroad to help Muybridge develop faster shutters and triggering mechanisms. Muybridge also experimented with more sensitive emulsions to shorten the exposure times. Muybridge had to take a break from his experiments due to personal drama. In 1871, he married Flora Shallcross Stone, who was 21, so 20 years his junior, but already divorced and their tastes did not align. She sought after attractions and amusements, went to the theater and parties, while he was also absent for days doing his own thing. They didn't seem to mind that discrepancy until Flora got romantically involved with Harry Larkins. Muybridge was aware of it, warned Larkins several times, but the affair apparently only got more serious. At some point, he found a picture of their newborns in Florado, with Harry written on the back, suggesting that Larkins may have been indeed the boy's father. In 1874, Muybridge went to Larkins and shot him point blank, got arrested and put into jail, where he reportedly had good influence on other inmates. Sanford arranged the defense attorney for Muybridge, who tried to plead insanity due to the head injury in the stagecoach accident 15 years prior. His attorney claimed, and several witnesses testified, that his personality changed after the accident from genial and pleasant to unstable and erratic. This reminds me of the most famous case of purported personality change upon frontal lobe injury on American railroads, the case of Phineas Gage. He appears in the history section of any neuroscience textbook, but the reality and extent of the personality shift is not clear from the little data we have. And even if there was a change, it's not clear whether it was indeed caused by the damage of the frontal lobe or the stress and bodily limitations after the injury. However, there are speculations that the brain injury might have even inspired Muybridge's interest in photography and career change. Although he had no recollection of the accident itself or the days preceding, he had a near-death experience with a sense of time being stopped or suspended. This could have influenced his perception of the surrounding world. When he observed animal or human motion, it would seem fragmented. But I digress. If you want me to tell the story and the controversy of Phineas Gage, or if you want to know about the development of artistic talent in frontotemporal dementia, please write so in the comment section. Muybridge himself undermined his insanity case by claiming that his actions were deliberate. The jury in the end decided that it was a justifiable homicide, and Muybridge was acquitted. This legal case seems quite famous. There is even a chamber opera based on it called The Photographer by Philip Glass. After the trial, Muybridge went off to Central America and there again worked on faster exposure times because he had to take pictures aboard a moving ship. By 1877, he was back to horses and he managed to capture Occident running, but as the shot was still fuzzy, he hired a retouch artist to improve the image and published the shot as a cabinet card. But many remained skeptical because of heavy retouching. A year later, Muybridge created a series of sequential pictures taken with 12 cameras that were triggered when the horse's legs hit the tripwires connected to an electromagnetic circuit. He then also demonstrated the process live to convince skeptics. The ultimate argument was the capture of an accidental detail. The saddle girth broke during the demonstration and the accident was captured by the cameras. These shots clearly showed that in gallop, horses indeed have all 4 feet off the ground, albeit not when they are extended, but when gathered under the body. Many found the stop-motion shots of horses to look off or ungainly. The common knowledge tells us that race horses run gracefully, and here comes Muybridge with funny poses. He then developed a projector called zoopraxiscope to animate the shots and demonstrates how these poses come together into a graceful gait. This is important for artists who use photographic references for their art because photos can capture awkward transitional poses or facial expressions that are not representative of the impression the real subject has with the entirety of its locomotion or facial expressions. This issue, together with perspective distortions, inappropriate focal length, and issues with light sensitivity and tonal range, are the reasons why many artists look down on using photographs as reference. I believe that we should dismiss no source of information and that photographs can greatly inform our art, like in this case of horse locomotion, but one has to be aware of the limitations, and to that end, learning basic neuroscience and physiology of sensory systems can be very helpful. If we know how our internal computer operates, we can engineer appropriate stimuli for it. And what else is art other than stimulus engineering? Back to Muybridge. In the late 1870s and 80s, he continued his experiments and took chronophotographic pictures of more horses, other animals, and athletes. He had a copyright dispute with Stanford, who commissioned a friend and physician, J.D.B. Stillman, to write a book based on Muybridge's pictures. The Horse in Motion, as shown by instantaneous photography with a study on animal mechanics, founded on anatomy and the revelations of the camera, in which is demonstrated the theory of quadrupedal locomotion. I love the titles of the time. Muybridge was not credited in the book. He sued Stanford to gain credit, but had no success. And to make things even worse, Britain's Royal Society of Arts withdrew the funds it offered to Muybridge for his photographic studies and even accused him of plagiarism. However, he found funding elsewhere. After his 1883 lecture at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, he found sponsorship at Penn. He continued studying locomotion and even shot sequences of movement of several neurological patients, so he contributed to neurology both as a case and as a researcher. In 1887, he published a huge portfolio with 781 plates and 20,000 pictures titled Animal Locomotion, an electrophotographic investigation of consecutive phases of animal movements, which has been reprinted numerous times and remains a great resource for animators and those interested in locomotion and movement. So let's thank Muybridge and all the parties involved and get back to the painting. The foreground is painted with increasingly thicker paint approaching gouache-like consistency to avoid cauliflowering into the already drying sky. Once the piece was relatively close to completion, I let it dry, first on the table, and then, when the paper was just a little moist on the inside, I covered it with a thick paper block and books so that the paper could dry relatively flat. A couple of days later, I deepened the tone of the sky. To avoid hard edges, I applied water lightly, more of it where I wanted to add color and less of it toward the periphery where I didn't plan to apply any paint. The semi-moist buffer zone ensures that the newly applied paint doesn't spread the whole way to the edge, but gradually slows down and creates a smooth gradient. When the piece is ready, it's time for reflection. The swirly shapes I painted in the periphery of the sky in attempts to vary the color remind me of retro sci-fi illustrations. And as much as I love the genre, this is not exactly what I want my art to be like. But that is what experiments are for. I would have never learned that if I haven't tried it. Please give this video a like or a dislike, share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.